Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with Andy Sloan, founder of the International Sustainability Institute based in Guernsey. Andy's going to give us a brief insight into the world of economics and then tell us about the Institute. Andy, good to see you.
Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. And I trust you are as well.
Actually, I should say good afternoon, shouldn't I?
I think we are just about it. Yes, that's right. That's right. Bearing in mind the time it's going to go out. Yeah, absolutely. Need to just slightly adjust your screen, Andy, because that's better. That's fine. Okay, let's go on that basis. Tony at 12 is a very nosy organisation, so we always want to know a little bit about the interviewees. So tell us a bit about your academic background.
Well, I've got I think it's at last count 4 degrees because clearly I'm a mug for this sort of thing. No, but I'm a PhD economist by training. I basically was an engineer first time around, and did a postgraduate when I was at the appropriate juncture, and then sort of like in my early 30s decided to stop the bus, get off, and go and study the topic that I wished I'd done the first time around. So I went up to Hull, which is where I'm from, and did a public policy masters or public policy economics masters, and then did a PhD. And my PhD in economics is a monetary and macro PhD. And basically my thesis or my hypothesis was that monetary shocks could have differential permanent effects on the UK regions.
Right.
And you say that, you go, well, of course, monetary shocks can have real impact nowadays. Well, but in those days when I did a PhD, it was sort of swimming against the tide, really, because obviously we'd ever been brought up on Friedman's that inflation is always and ever a monetary phenomena. And the conventional wisdom was that, demand shock and monetary shock couldn't have impacts. And I was motivated, and if you remember old Eddie George, when he went up to Newcastle and said, he didn't set interest rates in the interests of the Northeast.
Yeah.
And so anyway, 5 years later, I think I believe I proved the hypothesis. And well, 2 external examiners agreed with me, because I did a lot of it was econometrics. And what that meant was a lot of it was like the old nosebleedy maths, the stuff that I can't remember now. 20 years later, it's all Greek to me now, sort of thing. So I had the theoretical external exam, and I had the econometrics. So it was PhDs are quite a nerve-wracking stuff. I'd never had issues with exams.
Yeah.
But you get 2 blokes sort of sat there. Well, it was blokes for me, sort of can ask you anything they want.
Tell me though. Really? It was, quite a change to go from engineering to economics, wasn't it?
Well, I don't know, really. I mean, the economics was because, frankly, it was always my favourite topic. I used to sit outside the headmaster's study when I was at school and read. In those days, you used to have the old papers outside in the corridor, the FT and the Telegraph and the Times. And I used to go and read the business section, the economics section, because I just found it fascinating the way the economy works. And broadly speaking, what's really fascinating to me is making things better.
Yeah.
And hence I went into public policy economics once I'd done my sort of my academic stuff, and went off and basically it's the public policy and understanding how things work and getting them to work better that's the motivation for me, really. It always has been.
So from that point of view, rather than being in the commercial world as such, you'd be in the local authority stroke government world in terms of carrying out analysis and everything else.
Yeah, government world, the public policy stuff. So I mean, I'd have probably chewed your arm off to have an opportunity to be the governor of the central bank, sort of thing. Get to sort of sit there and moving one variable, interest rates, and sort of having all that power. But broadly speaking, I mean, I could have gone into commerce, and it's sometimes I look wistfully back and think, if there was ever an appealing job where you never had to be right, but always explained why you were wrong, but still made a fortune from it, you could have gone and been an economist for a commercial bank, because that's broadly what they do. Everyone gets the forecast at the beginning of the year, and there's always this massive range, and he goes, well, 95% of you are going to be wrong, aren't you? But you're all paid a fortune.
We're gonna test you on this one a little bit later in the interview. I seem to recall when I did O level commerce stroke economics that you could have two economists, same problem, two different answers, and they're both correct.
Well, yeah, it reminds me of the old economics joke about the economics student that goes back to the university department where he did his undergraduate degree, and he sees his old professor, and he sees the final exam paper, and he says, "But professor, the exam questions are exactly the same as when I sat them."
Yeah.
He goes, "Ah, yes, it's just the answers that have changed."
So I suppose a situation where you can really, as part of the exam, put down the answer and say, "What's the question?"
Well, I mean, it's one of those things that I don't know if you've heard of Paul Krugman, and he basically, the book's up on my wall, I think, still.
Yeah.
I read a book. He wrote a book in the 80s. He's a Nobel laureate nowadays. He's probably what you call nowadays in sort of the left of centre circles. But he wrote a book called Peddling Prosperity, and he had this axiom where he said economists are most listened to where they're in most disagreement, and where they're in most agreement, nobody pays attention to them.
Tell me, looking at forecast, how do you construct a forecast? I mean, I know I shot this one on you a bit late in the day. It is literally. Which way's the wind blowing?
I make a joke about me. I said I'm a macroeconomist. I like to have simple models.
Yeah.
And broadly, my models, I like to have two variables in the max. And my favorite has got one variable in it, and it's like inflation, which is a function of itself, and it's a function of all its historic values and all its future values. And a lot of economists will understand completely what I'm saying, but most people would, most sort of like the man on the Clapham omnibus would be going, "You're having a laugh, are you? You can't model something like that." No, but less facetiously, look, what people do in terms of modeling and forecasting, there's no exact science, quite frankly. And there's a difference between modelling and scenarios, right? And it's a very interesting point, which sort of comes to Brexit type sort of forecast of what's going to happen afterward. Broadly speaking, short-term forecasts are usually based on a model that the economist has constructed. So I'll go, do you know what? Economic output is a function of the labour market, and it's a function of inflation, for example, and it's a function in Guernsey of immigration, right? So what I do is I estimate econometrically the historic relationship between those variables and forecast a future value for economic growth. And broadly speaking, the variables, the relationship between the two of them, I parameterize. So I've estimated the parameters, that is the relationship between the two of them. And I plug in what I expect the future values of those other variables to be to give me a forecast for economic output. And broadly speaking, that's it. Now, in the short run.
Yeah.
And then you can get really, really quite complicated models, and you get national income models, huge models. The National Institute for Economic and Social Research has this huge model of the UK economy, and there's like hundreds of variables that they input in, and they come out with an answer. It's like the old supercomputer. You were sat there waiting for the answer to come out, and you get the piece of paper, and it tells you the answer is 42.
I remember it well, Hitchhiker's Guide.
Yeah, exactly. So you get these big models, or you get short-term models, which is a little like as a macro guy, you boil things down to some key relationships between 2 or 3 models and forecast based on that. And most people will have a range of models and then sort of average them out effectively. But that's forecasting, and that's short-run forecasting. What you get though, and this is where remember the old Brexit referendum, and then why do all the economists saying different things? What they're then doing is making an assumption of what the future will look like based on what they expect to be the result of what's called a structural change. And then what you do is you get basically people extrapolating forward their worldview of what things will happen. So you'll end up with scenario 1 and scenario 2. So, I remember doing some Brexit forecasting for in Guernsey. I'm going back 2014, 2015. So this is when the sort of referendum was a potential as opposed to an actual. And what you do is you go, do you know what? I think the UK, shackled out of the European Union, will become a much more buccaneering free trade economy, and so therefore it will be it will increase trade, which will increase economic growth, and it's trading with economies that are growing faster, and so therefore its growth rate will rise, right?
Yeah.
And they go, okay, that's one way you would look at it. And then what was it called? Remainers, or Ramonas they were called.
Yeah.
They are called. I'm not sure. Well, so no. My view of the world is that the frictions of trading with your largest economic partner will be the most important sort of variable or most important factor. And so by imposing extra costs on the economy with trading, like 60% of trade is with the European economy, and that will slow trade down or create frictions and costs, and growth will fall.
Yeah. So
who's right? Well, only time will tell.
There you go. Yeah, only time will tell.
And the irony is, it's a bit of both usually.
Talking about your previous employers, the states of Guernsey, how, as an economist, can you sort of try and get the numbers right when the politicians tell us that the deficit's about 80 million a year, and GPEG, which is the think tank, reckons it's closer to 220 million?
Well, they're making different assumptions of what's relevant, and GPEG have got a contingent liability in there. Now, I don't know if you saw it. I published, or the Institute published, a paper in January actually about the economic performance of the states, and broadly speaking, in terms of the tax review. So where is it? Do I have a copy of it to hand? Sod's law. I go. Oh, I do. Hold on.
Yeah.
There you go.
Here's one he did earlier. Yes, okay.
It's on the website.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute.
In the basis, we worked out that the state's estimate of the underlying size of the deficit going forward is in the sort of the right ballpark, frankly.
Yeah.
GPEG basically want to take the worst case scenario and say, oh, you've got a contingent liability of pensions, and if X, Y, and Z materialised, it'd be this. And it's like, well, X, Y, and Z may never come to pass.
Yeah.
So it's not to say there isn't a contingent liability there. It's just that it may never materialise. So what the 80 million is an estimate of is the as is current ongoing BAU scenario. Okay. Now, frankly, what the states, I personally think, has failed to do particularly well is explain those numbers with sufficient clarity.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the fact that I instituted something called the Fiscal Policy Panel when I was states economist. Broadly speaking, I created the fiscal framework for Guernsey, which is back in 2009 now. Very different to what it looks like today.
Yeah.
But broadly speaking, the rule was you only borrow what you can afford to pay the interest on. Yeah. And basically, you're constrained by what you can borrow, what those interest payments are, by your historic level of expenditures.
Yeah. So
broadly speaking, you could work out you could borrow 20% of GDP and pay the interest off, and that would be your maximum level of borrowing. Now, the idea is there was a debate at the time talking about whether or not to externally borrow to fund various odds and sods. And I wanted something in place, and this is why you've had the UK's Office of Budget Responsibility.
Yeah.
I want something in place to provide some sort of independent sense check, to provide, outside of the political process, because what the states is a funny animal in Guernsey. It's the executive, it's the administration, and it's the debating chamber as well. So it's all three arms of government. There's no constitutional checks and balances. There's no separation of powers like there is anywhere else. Yeah. And so, frankly, a lot of the numbers that are published, everyone goes, yeah. And I'll be honest with you, I read a lot of the stuff and go, well, there's some spurious granularity in there, and that's probably a bit of a red herring, and there's a bit of a smokescreen there on the numbers. Back in the day when Charles Parkinson was the treasurer, the treasury minister, when I first came to the island, what he was going to say, what the politics of the numbers were going to be, we used to have to listen to the radio and have a listen to him, whatever he got up and said in the budget, But nowadays you get about 5 or 6 pages of basically propaganda and spin, and there's no separation between the two. Now, I don't trust a lot of the numbers that are published. I'm not saying that they're not factually incorrect. It's just the manner of presentation is quite often done to be favourable to whatever the politician is saying that day. And the idea of having the fiscal. Yeah, the idea of having the fiscal policy panel was to have some separation to that, an independent report.
Yeah,
and it got canned.
Yeah,
it got canned halfway through the last state's term. And the sad thing is, none of the state's members noticed. So I mean,
Really?
that's I was really peeved off about that one, to be honest.
Yeah, I can
And I'd
imagine.
set it up to provide transparency and a check
Yeah.
and a balance there, and they did away with it. Obviously, I'll volunteer now. I'll quite happily, make a return. It's been 10 years since I worked at the state, so I could do it for them now if they want me to.
Doing a Frank Sinatra.
I used to have a sign on my door at the States called Minority Report.
Here's one for you. What causes inflation?
My heart of me goes, well, it's the money supply, isn't it? It's, I unfortunately, I was brought up on monetarism. The vast majority of inflation is a monetary phenomena. So when you have too much money chasing too few goods, you will get supply shocks, which is what we've got presently. So that, in general terms, the reason why economists always have different answers is there's the answer in the short run and there's the answer in the long run.
Yeah.
And often the two are different, and you're trying to reconcile the two. And nobody has a world economic model. It's not like meteorology, where the science can get quite close to forecasting.
Yeah.
There's no laboratory. All economics is made up, basically.
Yeah.
So broadly speaking, in the long run, inflation is a monetary phenomenon.
Yeah.
They have too much money chasing too few goods. So what we had for 10 years was interest rates out on the floor.
Yeah.
So they did quantitative easing after the financial crisis and never raised rates to where they should have been. And that was a big mistake by the Bank of England in 2010 and 2011, and they compounded that mistake for a decade. So instead of being punished for poor policy, the Bank of England just got given more and more powers and has become basically a leviathan with very few democratic accountability, in my view, nowadays. Anyway, long and the short is, because the interest rates are on the floor, they're too much money, quantitative easing, basically just pumping money into the system. So the whole financial system had too much money in it, which was storing up problems. Then what lit the touch paper, obviously, was COVID. And then you suddenly had a supply shock. You had a loss of supply of items, and then suddenly a return to those items, with whether it be with the commodities, be it with labour, whatever. And that lit basically what's called a short-term phenomenon, when you've got a mismatch in supply and prices. So it's like supply shock of the 70s with the oil price. It's just classic textbook.
Yeah.
So basically, supply and demand, which I'm doing it because of yours. If I'm going to do demand, I'm going to say that one's going to be supply for you. Supply went that way, and suddenly your price level has gone up, and it's a change in the price level. So that's what's happened. And a lot of prices are relative. So they're all relative to each other. So you've got a sudden change because of supply and demand changes, or supply changes, sorry, I should say, in the relative prices of a lot of goods, and they all need to find their new equilibria.
Yeah.
In between times, so all the people are trying to find that new price to reconcile new supply with current demand, or the demand's got to change or whatever. That takes a bit of time. And in the process, you've got too much money chasing too few goods. So the signals get confused. So what is a supply shock turns into a monetary shock, and you end up with inflation suddenly being out of the bag, and you get people turning around and saying, "Well, I need more money then." And suddenly you get into the old wage price spirals, and it's like it's a whole course, isn't it? Really, in terms of what causes inflation.
Well, I've seen
a few things there.
Yeah. Now, just before we get on to the institute, one thing: UK inflation in 2023 currently round about 10% or whatever. Citibank, big American banker, have come up with a figure of 2.3% by the end of the year. They weren't very good at calculating the way up, because I think they got up to about 18% on that. But do you think that's viable? Could it be as low as that by the end of the year?
Let's assume they got it wrong on the way up. They're going to get it wrong on the way down, then, aren't they?
Yeah.
What? It's going to fall from 10 to 2? No, not really, because frankly, the recession is now expected to be shallower than people were expecting. Wage settlements are doing all right. Particularly in the public sector.
Yeah. So
it's very unlikely that cost push sort of element of inflation is likely to subside to only 2%. So no, I mean, maybe if there is the issue that there's a whole massive amount of demand that's just been sucked out of the system by the interest rate hike. So if you're fixing today, and I made this point in the last month in the Guernsey press, if you're fixing today, you're looking at probably 3 times the rate you paid on a 5-year, which is like, wow. If you're buying new, that's something major. So what the Citibank are assuming, therefore, is that's going to be quite a big disinflationary shock, actually. So we've had the supply on the way up. So supply's gone up, and what they're saying is demand's going to fall.
Right.
And that's quite a big drop. So let's assume they got it wrong that way. They'll probably get it wrong that way. And I personally, I'm looking at 3 or 4% maybe by the end of the year. The problem with that is it's not enough for the bank to feel comfortable with dropping the interest rates.
Yeah.
So therefore, you get a second round impact. You go, well, if that's not the case, the Bank of England isn't going to be dropping rates. So the demand shock will carry on for a bit longer. So maybe it will fall a bit more because people's expectations are, and inflation used to be, for the last 20 years was always an expectations phenomena. So I used to say a function of future variables. So you say, well, look, when I came to Guernsey, we put in an inflation target. Yeah. I said, well, where'd you get an inflation target from? You haven't got any control of monetary policy. So no, but if you tell people inflation is going to be this and everything's benign, everyone will fix their prices. We used to get phoned up by people saying, well, what's the inflation rate? What do you expect it to be next year then? Oh, I expect it to be on the target. Yeah. And so you get people increasing rents and increasing prices, all fixed around, and it's an anchor. Yeah. So in terms of getting it down to 2%, but the concept is if people believe the Bank of England will squeeze it out to get it down to 2%, people will stop raising the prices more than, and I don't see it myself. I think it'll take a little bit longer than that.
Let's get on to the Institute because we've only got about 15 minutes left. It's the International Sustainability Institute. Can you define sustainability in this context?
Yeah, sustainability is that things can carry on as they are for almost indefinitely. Yeah. If something's unsustainable, it means that something's got to give at some point. And the problem with economics is that you can be unsustainable for a very long time. Yeah. Things can be out of kilter, for 10, 15 years. So we've just had monetary policy that wasn't sustainable. Yeah. But it took us best part of 15 years to discover it to be corrected. Yeah. Now, during those 15 years, it's created us a whole host of other problems. Yeah. It's created asset price inflation. Financial assets, the value of financial assets are more than 2 times what they are at the financial crisis. But world GDP is only something like 20-25% more. So in terms of apparent financial wealth, it's got massive. Actual economic output, it hasn't. They've got to come back into kilter. There's going to be a correction at some point. Yeah. So that's my definition of sustainability. And it's a traditional view of sustainability. And I'm applying that to the financial and the fiscal sphere. Yeah. Now, one thing of the last job I had at the state in Guernsey, sort of public sector as it was Deputy Chief Executive Director of Strategy at Guernsey Finance. And from my time previously at the GFSC, I'd sort of established Guernsey Green Finance, which is now called Guernsey Sustainable Finance, but basically a sustainable finance initiative to sort of pivot the island towards what's called sustainability, which is the current zeitgeist for sustainability, which is about investing in climate change mitigation, green finance projects, and the ESG marketeers, the environmental, sustainable and governance marketeers, have sort of expanded that environment, that universe, to lots of other jolly good things. And back in 2015, 2016, the UN published its estimate of the capital required to achieve what's called the Sustainable Development Goals. And 21 goals of, if you forget, the UN want to make the world a better place. They were established after the Second World War, world peace, eradicating hunger, all that sort of stuff. And they worked out how much it was going to cost in terms of trillions of capital needed to alleviate all the world's problems. Now, sustainability in its broadest sense is talking, sustainable finance in its broadest sense is about financing all of those goals. And you get that alongside what was the climate change agenda, which was close to my heart, because I've always been a bit of an environmentalist on the quiet. I grew up with Umweltschutz in the 80s and, acid rain and the UK being the dirty man of Europe, and our concerns back then. And so the climate change mitigation, the IPCC's, the International Panel on Climate Change, the goals of limiting the rise in temperatures to 1.5 or 2 degrees, that's close to my heart. And frankly, if we can achieve that, it would be a jolly good thing. And so those net zero targets, which is apparently if we can limit carbon emissions or stop them by 2050, we'll have managed to limit the change in the climate. Now that whole thing, that's all it's old Al Gore's an inconvenient truth, all that sort of thing. So but the regulatory world set up in around 2016 2017 the task force on climate change task force on climate TCFD task force on climate related financial disclosures, broadly speaking said, look, let's create some standards to help channel capital towards climate change mitigation. And on the back of that, we established the Green Finance Initiative in Guernsey. Right. When I left Guernsey Finance, the idea was I wanted to take something that was grounded in sustainability, so grounded in that green finance area, and create a research institution and a think tank that managed to provide genuine new thinking. An awful lot of the thinking you see published is but take that thinking on, and also to bring into that's the fiscal sphere, because my economics background, I've always had issues with the huge imbalances in trade and the huge imbalances in debt that exist. And they're often used to conflate stories, and often you'll find that the offshore world is acute demand, fiscal imbalances, tax losses, and then it's we're now the creators of global world inequality, all of which is usually a smokescreen for an onshore policymaker somewhere to need to have a scapegoat for poor policy over decades. And there's been huge amounts of examples of poor policy over the last 20 years, and the offshore world being blamed for it is something that gets my goat. So I created the Institute to be able to look at both of those areas concurrently, because they're both areas of real, genuine interest to me. And I really wanted us to be able to establish something.
Yeah.
Go on.
Do you feel
I talk, don't I?
Do you feel that you're in competition with other people on this, or have you sort of got a clear run ahead in terms of Guernsey and the Channel Islands?
In terms of the offshore world, I think it's a pretty clear area. I mean, you mentioned GPEG earlier, but that's a Guernsey thing that's domestic focused. And what I'm looking at is an external. I'm looking at global policy issues, financial, sustainable finance, and fiscal sustainability. The two key areas, and I'm taking a particular perspective from it. Now, on the sustainable finance side, there's a lot of competition. You get the big four churning out marketing literature day after day, and they've got most of it though is motivated by that, which is nothing wrong with it, but it's not necessarily the greatest motivation. And sort of the policy side of me, the one that's always been motivated by trying to figure out the answers to problems, thinks that therefore the Institute be able to provide a more altruistic perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue that
saying offshore, I worked at a bank in New York in the 90s.
And
offshore was Dublin and Lux. It is what it is.
The big four, of course, have always got a marketing motive behind anything they do, I guess. And so, from your point of view, you're looking at it as an independent person or an independent institute.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a lot. There is a lot about there is to be lobotomized to think there isn't lots of competition for it out there. There's just very few people or institutions providing this particular perspective. So I would hope going forward, that people will look to support the Institute, because I think it's a very valuable thing to have in the Channel Islands, in the Crown dependencies, overseas territories, to give us a vehicle to provide research that supports our worldview in a way. I mean, obviously, this isn't about doing research with the answer in mind. It's about having a particular worldview and wanting to create research that explains and justifies that.
So,
So, go on.
I was going to say, so tell us about a little bit about the business model.
Well, working to there's three main sort of sources of revenue. One is production of reports like this.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah.
So that one, there is you go on the website, you go to the research section. There's research. There's 2 research programs published, and we've got a public research program that we look for support from corporates, from individuals, and come along and support that particular piece of work. So each report that we do has somebody that's helped make it so.
Yeah.
You don't always get attribution. I prefer to have anonymous attribution. That way, the editorial. We own the editorial in process and the editorial sort of line. So in that respect, you're basically looking for people to support you, contribute to that piece of research. Then the other 2 areas is patronage, basically. What we're looking at right at this particular moment in time, which is, I think, when we had a conversation a few weeks ago, was that looking to step up a level. What I've done is, for the last, established this in December 21 now, about 13, 14 months later, demonstrated the research, got a publications track record, looking to demonstrate what we're up to. Here's our worldview. This is what we're looking to do. We're looking to take the sustainable finance and then look at, the offshore economics and the fiscal sustainability angle and put the 2 together. And so we're looking at, in terms of the resourcing, in terms of research as a network, to be able to sort of to fund those, looking for a degree of patronage over the course of the next 2 to 3 years while we establish ourselves commercially. And then the third is obviously, the third line is consultancy services and advisory, and other products. And so that's the 3 main lines of work, or lines of revenue. And we shall see.
But it's not uncommon, is it, for think tanks to have sponsorship to help?
There are, in terms of other sort of products. I hate that we use the word product, but it's a very Americanism to sort of say. But in terms of other products we're looking to establish, is actually undertaking an annual sort of survey of the state of the nation, and for people to be interested in that. But you're absolutely right. Especially in the early days, it's patronage is an important component of that. So I've demonstrated, like I said, in terms of what this, in terms of cost, it cost me to run it last year. I've got that in my head. I've worked out a business plan, and having the conversations with. At the end of the day, I'm looking at probably corporates to turn around and say, look, I'm looking for a circle of supporters. I'd call them patrons, corporates, where the understanding is you work in a group of international jurisdictions, the law firms, the global administrators, etc. It's worthwhile you having an independent research institute that generates material that you can both be proud of. It's got integrity and robust sort of nature to it, but also provides research that sort of defends our worldview. Now, I had a conversation with Rupert Pleasant the other week, the chief executive of Guernsey Finance, and joined just before I left. Is on the conversation that they've had with the City UK recently, saying we needed to generate more material to support ourselves as our business model, because quite frankly, Labour are about to get in. Well, I think
so.
that was sort of my point behind. I've been very public with making that point. In fact, I wrote the finance sector strategy that's on the state's website that makes exactly that point. And I've gone off and I've basically gone off and working through the strategy that I had when I was in the public, but in a private sector capacity. I've got a research program of demonstrating the economic contribution of capital that flows through the Channel Islands and the other overseas territories. And I like to think that the perspective that I'm going to come from, 15 years in the public policy sphere in Guernsey. I've represented the Channel Islands at the Code of Conduct Group on tax. I've dealt with the European regulatory agencies. I've dealt with Treasury. I know this area, and I know the research, what has been produced and what hasn't cut the mustard. And I have a very clear idea of the type of research agenda that we need to pursue for the next sort of 5 to 10 years. And that's what I'm doing basically. I'm going out there and knocking on doors and saying, look, I do this nice, this nice sustainable finance stuff. But there's also this tax stuff that needs to be done, because we need to be able to also have a sustainable business model as the channel owners.
Remind us of the website.
www.isici.org.
Say it again.
www.isici.org.
Fine.
And that's short for the International Sustainability Institute.
Channel Islands.
No, I couldn't get ISI. ISI had gone, so I had to stick the CI on the end. So International Sustainability Institute.net or isici.org.
Okay, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers will give it a go. Andy, we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but can I thank you very, very much for sparing me some time today? It's been most interesting.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Even more interesting to take a look at it at the end of the year, perhaps.
Yeah. So,
anyway,
at the end of the year.
I do wish you every success with the Institute, and I'm sure it will go well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Have a great afternoon.